I can prove anything and make you admit again and again that I can prove anything the way that it's writ again and again, and it's only 'cause you came here with your brothers too. If you came here on your own, you'd be dead. It's only 'cause you follow what the others do. It's no excuse to say you're easily led. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary, a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. So, I saw Longlegs. Longlegs, the latest film from horror auteur Oz Perkins. This film takes place in the early 90s and stars Micah Monroe as FBI agent Lee Harker. She's a fresh recruit to the Bureau who, after a very strange and grisly incident early in her career, this is depicted in the film in our introduction to the character, Harker is basically suspected by the Bureau of having psychic abilities, specifically a kind of clairvoyance, and thus finds herself being assigned to this decades-spanning dossier of murder-suicides taking place throughout the state of Oregon, all of which seem to apparently be unrelated, typical stochastic incidents of psychotic violence of family members, especially fathers, murdering their families and then themselves, except that all of them are connected by a series of coded letters left at the crime scene by an assailant known only as Longlegs. Harker's superior on the case is Agent Carter, played by Blair Underwood, who seems to be more confident in Harker's clairvoyance than even she is, and basically gives it to her like this. We know all of these cases are connected by the encrypted letters, but we don't actually have any evidence that anybody besides the husbands and fathers in these families were responsible for the crimes. So basically a Hail Mary attempt to get to the bottom of it is Harker is supposed to basically set her intuition loose and see what she can dig up, and in the process we learn more about Harker's own past. We also get cryptic snapshots into the life of Longlegs the killer themselves, here played in very heavy prosthetic makeup by none other than Nicolas Cage, who also served as a producer on Longlegs. And over the course of the film, as we delve deeper and deeper into the occult and satanic goings on behind these killings, we also realize that there is a more disturbing and intimate connection between the Longlegs murders and Harker's own past that makes it seem that far from her being simply discovered and randomly assigned, she's almost been drawn magnetically to this case. Longlegs is a movie that's been getting a decent amount of festival buzz for about a year or so, some really positive critical notices, so much buzz and so much positive appraisal that you honestly might think that this was some next great genre film debut. But in fact, Perkins, besides being a working actor, has been a fairly dependable presence in fantasy filmmaking for some time now. Officially speaking, his first breakthrough as a director was I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, which was released by Netflix in 2016. This was followed up a year later by The Blackcoat's Daughter, which was actually a film that Perkins completed before I Am the Pretty Thing, but was caught up in a situation where it kept having its digital and limited theatrical releases pushed further and further until it finally came out in 2017. I actually find that little note in Perkins' writer-director career kind of interesting, because it honestly does seem to, perfectly coincide with the proliferation of this new vogue in so-called elevated horror, this new trend of more cerebrally oriented horror films that kind of keep one toe in lowbrow genre cinema and another in the art house circuit. Now, I myself don't like the term elevated horror. I think it's a shallow descriptor that, quite frankly, doesn't do a good enough job of trying to describe the phenomenon in horror revival that occurred in the second half of the 2010s. And again, this kind of all coincides perfectly with Perkins' breakthroughs as a director in the horror genre. Because as he tells it, besides being technically his first film, The Blackcoat's Daughter was apparently quite difficult to get financed precisely because when he was first developing and securing the production at the beginning of the 2010s, horror was actually, strangely enough, starting to be seen as a slumping genre, something where if we kind kind of print the horror fan legend here, had kind of started to be seen as a genre that had been saturated with cash grab remakes of older and foreign films, and really grisly torture porn that had alienated the general public from horror films, and was thus not as safe a genre to invest in anymore, even for the low-cost, high-return formula that low-budget horror films can usually depend upon. But then in 2015, of course, Perkins completes his first film, The Blackcoat's Daughter, at basically exactly the same time that we start seeing this trend of more boutique distributors, such as the now practically synonymous A24, who bought the theatrical distribution rights to The Blackcoat's Daughter. This is a period we saw these boutique distributors starting to increasingly co-sponsor and distribute more marginal, cerebral, often more caustically stylish kinds of horror movies, and basically presenting them alongside their larger portfolio of more highbrow dramatic films and international pickups. Which creates this really interesting phenomenon around about 2014 and 2015, where suddenly horror as a genre gets revitalized because while the general public had been kind of alienated from the parochial enjoyment of horror movies, companies like A24 and Neon and Radius, while they weren't explosively successful at first, they slowly started to realize, oh hey, there might be a way to make a lot of money off of low-budget horror movies, because you can both depend upon the resiliency of the core horror fan base, while also compensating for the lost revenue from Main Street filmgoers by pulling from the just as reliable cohort of art house cineasts, many of whom are younger and tend to be more immersed in a kind of boutique or alternative fondness for older genre cinema already, but who are also going to be more open-minded and a great source of word of mouth to the general public for horror films that are on the artsier side. So at the same time that Perkins is struggling to get The Blackcoat's Daughter released, and he's already making I Am the Pretty Thing for Netflix, you start having this string of word-of-mouth so-called elevated horror hits that start out small with It Follows for Radius. You have The Witch doing really impressive numbers for A24, and then the official banner empire for American horror, Blumhouse, gets in on the act and has a huge hit with Get Out for Universal in 2016, and it's suddenly like, to everybody who's paying attention, from boutique distributors to streaming platforms to major studios, it's like, okay, this is where the money is. The people want trendy, sleek, stylish, professional looking, but also sort of horror movies that project this sense of being elevated, of having a serious artistic substance, of being about something, that it just kind of wears on its sleeve, especially socio-political or psychological themes. And so that's sort of where Perkins' career as a horror auteur is kind of perfectly situated on that timeline. First, he's just struggling to get his first film released, then 2017 and 2018 rolls around, and it's suddenly like any horror news is news about exactly the sort of horror film towards which Perkins is more oriented. And in the intervening years, Perkins has only managed to complete one other horror film, which was Gretel and Hansel from 2020. But with Longlegs this year, he's on kind of a roll right now. He's got another film, an adaptation of Stephen King's The Monkey, slated for a release early next year, and another project apparently simultaneously in post-production. And with Longlegs, Perkins is basically in the best position he could be in, because whereas none of his previous films have been particularly critically successful, again, Longlegs sort of has a high hurdle to clear. In fact, that the early responses from critics, both on the festival circuit and now preparing for its current release through distributor Neon, the hype is so high that I can't help but feel that I'm sort of exactly in the position that I don't want to be in terms of expectations. Or maybe I'm in exactly the position I want to be in, because while I'm certainly familiar with Perkins' career, this is the first film by him that I've actually seen, so I might as well be seeing the word-of-mouth hit debut of a budding auteur and not a guy who's been doing this for the better part of a decade now, just plugging away, making his own sort of eccentric little horror flicks that are so often mentioned in the broad and probably rather overly broad context of so-called elevated horror, especially The Blackcoat's Coat's daughter, but which are never necessarily metonymic of where horror is at and simply haven't managed to spark the intrigue and investment of film critics until now, to say nothing about whether any of his films are even as remotely successful financially as your Hereditaries or whatever. I'm jumping into the deep end of this guy's latter filmography on the good faith of a critical establishment that I know has its own weird cloistered attitudes, and I know has all of these perverse incentive structures to try to keep published film criticism relevant and popular in the age of Rotten Tomatoes and other review aggregators. And when I know deep down in my soul, while there are plenty of so-called elevated horror films that I quite enjoy, while there are many of them that I really like, my tendency with this sort of trend in borderline middlebrow art house genre filmmaking has always been kind of to go, because you know what the deal is, right? When it seems to be going for something more serious, it always comes off to me as either overly serious or just glib in its affectations of seriousness. When it tries to do something more quirky and funny, it most often comes off to me as someone trying way too hard to endear the movie with this kind of winking self-awareness of, like, you know, how stupid of an idea, say, Gretel and Hansel is, where the trailer for the movie itself, for all intents and purposes, practically looks like it's even kind of a parody of a much more successful so-called elevated horror movie like The Witch, where it's almost like Perkins is deliberately thumbing his nose at the very association of his own films with this elevated horror trend, almost like something like Gretel and Hansel is going, oh god, another modernized, deconstructed horror riff on a classical fairy tale. Bravo. But at the same time, it's almost like the movie is provoking you when you see the trailer. It's like, is this so stupid looking that that's part of the point? Like, is the point that Perkins is looking at the sorts of horror films that are critically and financially successful and is sort of like, this is what you want? Okay, if this is what you want, here it is. Let me see how gangly and stupid I can get before someone calls me out on the fact that this is all just a joke. And I know, Ian, you didn't see these movies, you can't know enough to even begin to conjecture like that, and you're absolutely right. I haven't seen Gretel and Hansel because I saw the trailers and made the mature decision that it looked stupid. And if it was the deliberate joke it seemed to be, I got it from the trailer. But yes, I didn't see Gretel and Hansel. I didn't see I Am the Pretty Thing. I didn't see The Black Coat's Daughter. But I did see Longlegs. And let me tell you something, fam. If this movie is the one that I keep seeing described by critics, the one where it really is this great atmospheric blend of supernatural horror and psychological thriller and police procedural with this persistently effective, serious mood of disturbance and unease, then I'm sorry, Longlegs sucks. It sucks. It's a terrible movie. It's not atmospheric. It's not disturbing, and it's all built on a script that is just so mortifyingly wooden to listen to on top of being stupid. If this is the film that is getting this kind of buzz for being atmospheric or disturbing, it's time to start asking some serious questions about the nature of film criticism in the age of Rotten Tomatoes. And it was always time to ask these questions, but it seems like we've gone past the point at which Rotten Tomatoes and review aggregators are just misrepresenting film criticism and the value of critical engagement with movies and more, to the degree that it seems to have radically altered the modern day critical landscape itself, where film critics almost seem to talk and write like they are promoting the movie the way that the distributors prefer, rather than just accurately describing objectively what a movie like Longlegs is like. Because again, if Longlegs is a joke, if it's a punk on the audience, that's not something you can sell very easily. You're certainly not gonna get that from the trailers or that really disturbing poster focused on Micah Monroe's horrified reaction to something off screen, or the crime scene with the bodies hidden under those sepulchral tarps. That's how you sell a horror movie to a mainstream audience, but it doesn't really give you at all a good impression of what Longlegs actually is. And it's exactly the sort of thing, and this is a major issue of journalistic malfeasance on the part of mainstream film criticism, honestly. It's exactly the sort of thing where everyone is selling this disturbing, atmospheric, new great horror movie to a general public who is then going to see it and find out that it's not that kind of movie at all, and more often than not come away thinking the movie either sucked or at least just having internalized no greater appreciation for what it's doing or what I'm conjecturing Perkins might be doing in this very kind of devious way. On the other hand, if I'm right, and this was Perkins' objective to satirize the so-called elevated horror film cycle, like, there are so many individual elements in terms of how Longlegs is constructed and presented that makes it seem as if it should be interpreted as something that's going for this earnest sense of oppressive atmosphere and dread. And quite frankly, what most of it seems to boil down to is two very typical factors, one of which is the cinematography by Andres Orocki, which is quite honestly super typical of a certain strain of the more artsier kind of middle-brow horror and psychological thriller. This kind of eternally autumnal lighting and color palette where the most emphasized shades are brown and pallid white, and where the framing, especially in the context of the more procedural construction of the plot, can't help but recall on the one hand the films of David Fincher, and on the other hand the Jonathan Demme, Ted Talley adaptation of Silence of the Lambs. That latter film is constantly being brought up in terms of influences on Longlegs, especially on Nicolas Cage's character, and put a pin in that because I have some thoughts on that character and its very obvious allusions to Silence of the Lambs. And then the other factor is an honestly really quite impressive sonic landscape woven together by a composer known only as Zildji, who is so difficult to find information about that theories abound that it might just be a pseudonym for Oz Perkins' brother Elvis Perkins, who previously composed for 2 of his films without a pseudonym. So my private theory, my personal theory, is that Zildji might actually be a pseudonym for the entire sound design team that worked on Longlegs under sound designer Eugenio Battaglia. This movie has such a dense mixture of both really synthetic, almost industrial music scoring, but also these flashes of non-diegetic sounds that I wouldn't be surprised if they basically attempted something like composing the entire film's musical landscape from a sound design perspective. But the more and more acclimated you get to both of these elements, which are both in their own way either rather consummately executed or even very impressive, the more acclimated you get to them, the more and more it dawns on you that the primary feeling that accompanies Longlegs is not a sense of overpowering dread like Zodiac or Silence of the Lambs. Instead, the feeling that you keep getting acclimated to is one of just utter and honest unpredictable absurdity. Like, a lot of critics who are more tepid on Longlegs seem to attribute this more to Perkins kind of just biting off more than he can chew and trying to combine not only elements of supernatural horror with police procedural and neo-noir, but also the combination of really apparent influences from Fincher to Demme's adaptation of Silence of the Lambs to very obviously David Lynch to a certain extent. There's absolutely an element of Lynchian detachment and, again, absurdity to how Monroe and Underwood's characters interact, especially with the way that the latter seems to be this so much more like kind and cautiously enthusiastic personality in the film. Like, he really seems to have more of a Dale Cooper-esque faith in the power of mysticism and intuitive insights to solving this great decade-spanning mystery. And then there's just a certain quality of prose in Perkins' writing of dialogue that creeps up on you more and more as you're listening to it and watching the movie, where you start to question whether, like, in the midst of this movie that is still containing some quite grisly and caustically stylized depictions of quite brutal violence, is still apparently on a surface level going for this more germane David Fincher ripoff, Mindhunter kind of look, in the midst of all that will increasingly seem to just pepper these really deadpan and awkward bits of dialogue that just keep happening so much more frequently that you start to, again, go where I'm going with this, start to suspect that there's a genuine sort of black comic intent behind them. So by the end of it, all the absurdity of Longlegs goes way past the obvious influence of David Lynch and Twin Peaks and all the way into the genuinely goofy realm of M. Night Shyamalan, but like combined with the just nakedly vulgar sensibilities of Rob Zombie. Like, even Nicolas Cage's performance of the Longlegs character, in both its presentation and how broadly he plays this character with, again, this increasingly absurd dialogue against this muted, brown, pallid backdrop that it just objectively does not fit in terms of a contrast of tones, it starts to feel even less like an homage to Buffalo Bill and Demi's Silence of the Lambs, and more like an estranged cousin of the Firefly family in Zombie's Devil's Rejects trilogy. It's not just that Perkins is blending genres of supernatural horror and psychological thriller and police procedural, it's the discordance between the overall look and sound of the movie and how in keeping and in tradition it is with a certain strain of middle-brow art house genre movies that have persisted so long as the decade-defining trend in horror movies, and then just how increasingly silly the movie just keeps feeling. Like when Agent Carter is literally giving Lee Harker the cliche, "That's it, Harker, you've gotten too close to this, I'm taking you off the case" spiel, and it's like, this is like a joke in The Simpsons. You're doing this totally cliche scene, but in the absurd context of a film where the more and more it goes along, the more I realize that it shares a lot of narrative parallels to the Larry Cohen exploitation classic God Told Me To. Now, Longlegs doesn't have a climactic twist nearly as absurd as God Told Me To, but it does go off the rails. It gets absurd. It gets real silly. And it just becomes one of those things where it's precisely that sense of discordance between the presentation of the film, both in terms of the style of it, but also in the almost meta-textual way that its publicity campaign and critical response has become part of the experience of the film. The discordance between that presentation of Longlegs and the utter absurdity of so much of it can only lead me to the conclusion that, like, this is an elaborate punk. Like, this is the point. The point is that this movie is supposed to be an absurdist parody and satire of so-called elevated horror movies as a trend. That Perkins is not making an earnest thriller here, but a really elaborate deadpan joke about how easy it is to, say, get the current establishment of the film criticism mainstream to bend over backwards to fawn over how atmospheric and disturbing and stylistically layered a film is, with many of them being able to pick up on the references or influences to, say, David Lynch, but failing to identify that this is a joke. And the joke is on us if we take it seriously. And I earnestly think, especially for anybody watching this who came out of Longlegs feeling like I did, what the was that this is honestly the most effective way to understand the movie, or at least interpret it in private, regardless of intent. This is like what Jonas Ackerland's Spun was to the late 80s, early 90s romantic drug movie cycle, or like Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers was to sci-fi action movies. This is a project where Perkins, a guy who was previously all but completely ignored when he was at the cutting edge of the so-called elevated horror cycle, is now here 10 years into this same cycle and going, I am going to assume all of the cliche preconditions of this type of movie, push it to its logical extreme of absurdity, not only so that I can make fun of it, not only so that I can parody it, but so that I can satirize the fact that so many critics, the people who are supposed to be responsible for cultural journalism and intellectual interpretation, satirize the fact that so many of them completely miss the joke. Except in the case of Spun and Starship Troopers, the filmmakers were prepared to accept being called irresponsible hacks in order to get their own points across about their movies and what they were satirizing in the particular cinematic cycles that they were keyed into. With Perkins, it's even saltier because he's literally making a movie that opens with a quote from Bang the Gong by T-Rex, which in context is a really weird and clear allusion to sexual molestation of children, and then ends with a character literally maniacally crying, "Hail Satan!" And this character has already died in the context of the movie, so literally that's the ending of the movie. After we get to the climax, the last shot of the movie is a character who is already dead in a flashback, but it's not even really a flashback. It's just an intercut to a take from that same scene that was not in that scene. So it's just this non-contiguous moment with this dead character from that scene, just saying "Hail Satan" like this is a movie put together by 15-year-old metalheads. And with that, Perkins is being showered with praise for how good he is at threading a sense of atmosphere. It's like, no, this is absurd. This is stupid. That's the whole point. This isn't Rosemary's Baby. This is House of a Thousand Corpses. This is just what so much of the elevated horror fad feels like. It's just recycled exploitation trash made up to look like it's more technically competent and thematically substantive than it is. And at a certain point, it almost feels like there's a conspiracy. Like, this many people can't really take this seriously, right? Mark Kermode isn't seriously sitting here being like, "Oh, this is genuinely creepy." It's like, bruh, you saw The Wicker Man and The Exorcist. This is genuinely creepy? What are you talking about? Do they have your kids in a black site somewhere? It's not creepy, it's boring. The only thing that makes it interesting is when you start to realize how absurd it is beneath all the cliche technical textures, but otherwise this is just God told me to, just like Get Out was literally just a blaxploitation horror movie, just like The Witch was just like all those great British folk horror classics like Blood on Satan's Claw. This is the same old exploitation garbage, except now apparently what's trendy is to make exploitation garbage deliberately boring. Like, we can't even have fun anymore. I can't even go to see a movie about a clairvoyant detective trying to stop a satanic serial killer without it looking like brown and pallid all the time. Like, at the very least, I thought we would be having more discussion right now about how Nicolas Cage's Longlegs character is, like, clearly supposed to be some mincing queer stereotype, but even that irony seems to be lost on most of the folks who seem to be heaping praise on Longlegs for all of the wrong reasons. Like, obviously, the plot of Longlegs is steeped a lot in themes of satanic panic, but like most horror movies that exploit satanic panic, it goes right for the satanic part, but completely forgets the panic part, which is what is the actually interesting thing about a satanic panic. And part of that is clearly the presentation of Cage's character as this Satanist who never explicitly molests children, but where the threat of sexual violence is always being symbolically acted out in various ways, but where this character is also in this makeup and his dress so clearly supposed to be somewhat effeminate and very much, and again, I think intentionally on both Perkins and Cage's part, really going for that collision in the popular psyche of satanic panic between themes of satanic ritual abuse of children and what has now become popularized in our current wave of satanic panics as the grooming of children by queer people, especially by men who present as women. But please understand scare quotes. I'm not going to waste my time explaining the scare quotes to anybody. Like, it could not be more clear to me that anybody taking Longlegs seriously enough to talk about how atmospheric it is should also be serious enough to kind of be like, yo, Oz, Cage, what the is this shit? Because you know what you're doing, right? Like, this is an obvious and intentional allusion to Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs, but you're just filing off any explicit references to sexual orientation or transgenderism in order to present this gender-ambiguous creeping molester who gets off on violence and specifically upon destroying nuclear families. Like, I suppose I should praise Perkins for being a better student of the actual content of Satanic Panics, the panic part, as opposed to the cohort of hacks that surround him that just are fascinated by Satan. It's boring. Satan is boring. I'm sorry to break the news, everybody. The devil is boring. I hate the devil. To the devil with the devil, says I. But there is an almost Craig Zoller-esque provocation going on with this character, where it's almost like the filmmaker is alluding to the fact that you all know what I'm going for here, but I just had to shave off the obvious thing I'm getting at, because if I just spell it out explicitly, what is now just the thematic subtext of this character, everyone's going to come after me. I'm going to get canceled, but some of you out there, you get what I'm, dog whistling and referring to. Not dog whistling intentionally, but dog whistling subversively, so you can find out who's not gonna call out the dog whistle. Like, Longlegs is clearly doing the evil gay or evil trope, and I don't know why I don't see more discourse about it. And I'm not even trying to drum up discourse. I'm just saying that this is a part of the pattern of my appreciation of Longlegs as this kind of satiric provocation, where part of the metatextual absurdity of it is that Perkins is just very nakedly playing into the most deranged and even outright bigoted aspects of Satanic Panics, in the same way that Verhoeven played into the most outright absurd and sadistic aspects of fascistic thinking in American action movies, just to see how few people in positions of cultural authority, and especially how few people in the general public, actually had the ironical thinking to understand that that was what he was doing, and he was doing it with an objective, as a joke, to see how many couldn't figure it out, how many people lacked the ironical thinking, how many people just accepted the ideological subtext. And at least at that degree, a really tasteless joke, and if I am right in my conjecture that this movie is just an elaborate punk, a nestled satire of the elevated horror cycle and its absurdities, I will say that on balance would just be something that I don't like about the film, regardless of earnestness or unearnestness. It wouldn't be the type of gag that I thought fit into the overall tapestry of what keeps Longlegs at least halfway interesting as an exercise in absurdity, even past the point where, for the most part, I just don't think that what the film is at least parodying is that interesting of a parodic subject, to an extent that I didn't find it that much more entertaining or engaging than the average film it's parodying. But this is gonna sound really weird. I'm gonna give Longlegs a 2.5 out of 5. Overall, I just did not like this one, but I'm going to encourage everyone to see it, and I'm probably going to see it again real soon, because this is a rare feeling. I already had a moment like this year where I was seeing an honestly very creatively similar and quite provocative experiment in horror filmmaking made possible by the absurdities of this elevated horror cycle. Of course, I'm talking about Chris Nash's In a Violent Nature, which I still loved to bits. And what I said about that film is that even if it isn't your cup of tea, it's the sort of thing that is productive to see as a cinephile or as someone seeking to expand or at least reinforce their appreciation of cinema as an art form, because it taps you into the frame of mind that a film doesn't need to work on a conventional level or a baseline entertainment level. It can just be an experiment, which means that it can just be awkward and even flawed as the experiment is, and just allowed to be what it is, and that's what makes it a good experience. I certainly wasn't as fond of Longlegs at all as I was of In a Violent Nature, but I will say that in as much as I kind of just didn't like it, I have to give it this. I'm still thinking about it, and not just in a passing way. I went really quickly from not wanting to write this review about some stupid, overrated festival darling horror movie I saw, to now where I am, where I've completely broken my promise to myself to actually try to write shorter reviews. God damn, I wrote 11 pages of this. But anyway, my point is, I didn't enjoy Longlegs, but I do respect it enough that I'm going to recommend it, and I'm going to try seeing it again, this time thoroughly in the frame of mind that, okay, this is a black comedy. This is a satire. Don't fight the absurdity. Go with the absurdity. If you made it to the end of this review, thank you. I imagine if you made it this far, you have a lot to say to me about what you think I got right, what you think I got wrong. Sound off in the comments, and also don't forget to share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'll catch you all next time.